Hi, and welcome to Digital Defense, the weekly cybersecurity and privacy show broadcasting to you live from the Bloomberg News Bureau in Washington, D.C. I am your host, Jordan Robertson. I'm a cybersecurity reporter here with Bloomberg. And today's show is going to be dedicated to a major investigation that we published, that a colleague, Mike Riley, a colleague of mine, and I published today online, and will be in tomorrow's Business Week, the cover of tomorrow's Business Week magazine. I wanted to open the floor. I wanted to talk a little bit about this story and open the floor to viewers to ask me questions about this story. This story has been a long time in the making, well over a year of reporting. It's about a hardware supply chain attack from China involving malicious microchips embedded on server motherboards bound for US-based companies. Those malicious microchips are effectively like a permanent infection on a computer. They are the ultimate backdoor that stays hidden from the operating system, hidden from almost all commercial security tools. It's kind of a super hack. It's taken us a lot of time and a lot of reporting to pull this story together. But I wanted to walk you through some of the reporting process, talk about some of the issues we raised, and answer some of your questions. So we're going to dedicate today's show to this topic. We're going to be talking a lot more about it in the future. We think supply chain security and hardware security is a really, really important topic, and one that's kind of undercovered, kind of publicly. So, well, without further ado, so the story's called The Big Hack. Wherever you're watching this program, whether it's on the Bloomberg terminal, whether it's Periscope, Facebook, YouTube, if you have any questions for me, please type them into the comment section. As you wish, and I get a real-time feed of those here, so I will see those and I'll be able to dive into some questions. There are lots of questions, lots of interest in this story. So if you've read the story, thank you. If you haven't, perhaps you might find it intriguing. So the story is called The Big Hack. Again, the cover of this week's Business Week: How China Used a Tiny Chip to Infiltrate America's Top Companies. The top line summary of this story is this: in 2014 and 2015. According to U.S. intelligence and other government officials, a specialized unit of China's People's Liberation Army, China's military, devised a way to embed malicious microchips in the motherboards of computer servers bound for U.S. companies. The two companies we highlight in our story are Apple and Amazon. We have, in terms of the sourcing for this story, we have robust sourcing on this. This is 17 total sources. These are senior officials throughout government. These are senior employees of both Amazon and AWS in positions to have direct firsthand knowledge of the events described here. Again, 17 sources, well over a year of reporting, including senior officials throughout the government and senior, employees and executives of both AWS, and Apple. The story is effectively this: Supermicro. The story is not even about the big companies I just mentioned. In many ways, the story is about Supermicro. Supermicro is a company that many viewers may never have heard of before this story. I was not familiar with this company before we started this reporting, but it turns out that Supermicro is one of the world's biggest makers of server motherboards. By some estimates, it's the biggest maker of server motherboards. What that means is that, if your data is passing through a data center every time you use your phone or every time you log onto a website, chances are your data is touching a Supermicro server. They sell to large cloud companies, web hosting companies. Obviously, again, at one time, Apple has since severed the relationship, AWS and others. The significance of Supermicro is they're a US-based company. They're based in San Jose, not far from the headquarters of all the major tech companies. They employ hundreds of engineers in San Jose that do nothing but design motherboards. That's their thing. They've got hundreds and hundreds of motherboard designs, and basically any kind of configuration a client could dream up, they either have in their product catalog or they can design. Highly customizable servers is kind of their main thing, and they're an American company. But like most computer hardware makers, they make their equipment overseas. So, the majority of Supermicro's computer motherboards, are manufactured by subcontractors in China. And it's those subcontractors in China that really become a key player in this story. Because what we report is that according to US officials, in 2014 and 2015, those subcontractors were infiltrated by operatives of the PLA. And what happened inside those facilities, again, according to our reporting and according to sources, is that those individuals, were able to either pressure or threaten or convince, those plant managers, those company owners, to accept unauthorized modifications to the motherboards their factories were producing. And the significance of that is those server motherboards get sent off to Supermicro, they get boxed into servers. Those servers are then sent to end users, including AWS. We report their Beijing data center had Supermicro servers. We also report that a company called Elemental Technologies, which AWS bought in 2015, which made a server product. It was a video transcoding server appliance. We report that AWS discovered malicious chips in those appliances, which were made by Supermicro and supplied to Elemental. And at the same time, Apple was planning to be a major buyer, had plans to be a major buyer of Supermicro hardware. There were plans to order as many as 30,000 Supermicro servers over the course of 2 years, from Apple. And what the story reports, again, if you haven't read it, it's long, it's in depth. I hope you like it. I hope you find it informative. It's a new area of security risk that not a lot of folks have looked at outside of government intelligence agencies. So here's what we know. We know about the attack. These malicious microchips were seeded into these servers at the manufacturing stage. They were pre-programmed to do a very specific, very small, but very devastating thing. According to our sources, what these chips did was they altered the operating system. When the server boots up, the chip fires the malware. That's effectively what they do. You think of malware as just a software package. All the attackers did was they put that software package into a chip, embedded the chip on the board, and put it in a place where that malware could communicate directly with the operating system in a way it needed to, with the approvals that it needed to, the authorizations from the computer. And what happens there is the chip modifies the operating system to accept further updates, further malicious updates. It modifies the kernel or the core of the OS, which is the most protected layer, the most protected part of the operating system because of the sensitivity of the functions it handles. And then it does another thing. Again, two very small, discrete things. Modifies the server's OS, and then it also pings out to a series of pre-programmed anonymous computers on the internet. The attackers know and control those IP addresses. The idea of anonymous meaning they're not on any blacklist. These are new, clean servers that the attackers control. What happens from there is the attackers, if the chips land in a network where they're able to get a connection to the outside network, the attackers will get an alert. They will get kind of a phone home. They'll get a beacon, back to these command and control servers. And from there, these servers become a staging area for future attacks. They are a landing point. And there's a lot of confusion, I think, there certainly was for us when we started reporting this story, about, okay, why would you go through the trouble to embed something as small as that, like a tiny little chip? And in fact, that's not a chip. That's actually a signal conditioning coupler. That is a kind of a harmless computer motherboard component. Malicious chips were disguised to look like those, or contain design elements meant to mask their true purpose as a chip on the board. And what happens there, the reason you go through all of that trouble is not to, in the story we write that, that these chips were found inside Apple's network. This was under the Siri division. So our initial inclination was, well, this must have been an attack to steal Siri customer data. And we were quickly corrected by many sources that this attack is not about customer data at all. It doesn't matter where these servers landed. The fact that they landed in Apple, the fact they landed in an AWS network, the fact they landed in an AWS acquisition target that was a major national security contractor and a major defense contractor, that's the hack. The hack is, how do we get a backdoor into these servers that wind up inside sensitive networks? And again, the point of the chip is you're not going to exfiltrate terabytes of data with this chip. The chip is just a means to an end. It is just a little mini gun. It's like a little weapon, that pokes a hole in the security of those servers and allows the attackers to kind of come and go as they please. And, so what happens here is that once attackers have access to those servers, those compromised servers, they can update them with exploits for those particular machines based on whatever software that end users have uploaded, or have included on them. And the other thing they can do is they can start performing reconnaissance. Now, hacks take a long time. People don't, I think, recognize this generally. Hacks take a long time. Nation-state attacks take a long time. The attackers might be in a target network for years, very carefully trying to figure out how to move to the next step, how to move from one infected server to another, then potentially to a network switch, then potentially to a router and onto end users' computers. A very slow, methodical process. The US hacking apparatus works this way. Chinese hacking apparatus works the same way. These chips, apparently, according to our reporting, are a very significant element of this Chinese attack that occurred in 2014 and 2015. In terms of what was stolen, as we say in the story, this is not about access to consumer data. This is about access to long-term access to corporate intellectual property and sensitive government networks, particularly. So when you're reading this story, don't think, they found these chips in Apple's network, according to our sources. That means they must have stolen all my Siri data. It's not what this attack is about at all. It's about access to sensitive networks, long-term access. And with that, we're getting some really good questions, so thank you for sending those in. I'm just going to get to these questions, and we can talk about the story. Typically on this show, we focus on kind of tips and tricks for securing your digital life is kind of the tagline we've come up with for the show. This show is not about that. I mean, this is about a major national security threat, involving manipulated hardware. And what do you do about it if you're an organization? So don't expect the usual content on today's show. So we'll talk about the story. First question here, is this just the US only or elsewhere? Well, our story focuses on US-based companies that were impacted. That was kind of the scope of our story. But you'd have every reason to believe that, because China has this capability, that they could, in theory, deploy it against any, potential target of interest for the Chinese military and intelligence communities. Would not be limited to US alone. Next question here is, this has been going on in Europe for quite a while. What are they doing there to prevent it? Well, here's what we know. When we first started this reporting, I think we kind of assumed that large companies have really robust hardware security detection systems in place. Like, you just assume kind of that whatever the equivalent is of like the most cutting edge piece of antivirus software or malware detection software, whatever it is, also exists for hardware. It actually doesn't. Hardware, as one of the quotes we have in the story, is considered like black magic. Like, there aren't a lot of engineers, that work on it compared to the number of software engineers that, kind of exist and are working in that field. There are very, very few security programs for hardware. Most of the security programs are for software. Now, you can detect a hardware attack in software, but you have to look very, very closely, and you've got to be finely attuned to this hardware risk. Otherwise, you're going to miss it. Because what happens is the chip modifies the operating instructions of a server in such a finite way, in such a delicate way, that if you're not looking specifically for that modification, chances are you might miss it. And if the attacker is smart and patient, which apparently these attackers were, they will exfiltrate data very, very slowly for a very long time. They might wait several months if they feel like their attacks might have been detected, and they're going to be very patient in their activities. So, in terms of what companies are doing, companies are doing spot checks of hardware that come in. They might rip apart a server and run the motherboard through an X-ray machine. For the most part, I think organizations tend to rely on their software defenses, their network defenses, to catch malicious activity, and that's a perfectly reasonable strategy. I mean, you have to have good network defenses. But as one person put it to me earlier, they said with a supply chain attack, you're basically bringing the infection in yourself. So a lot of folks we talk to say there just needs to be better mechanisms for inspecting hardware, testing hardware, evaluating hardware. It's a very difficult problem, this issue of securing hardware, but it's not unsolvable. Next question here, what preventative measures are being taken? Is the FBI doing anything? Well, as we report in the story, the FBI, for several years now, since 2015, has had an ongoing cyber and counterintelligence investigation into this attack. What that means is you should not expect this ever to see anyone in handcuffs over this attack. The nature, the nature of these hardware attacks are that, the counterintelligence investigation is focused on were there people inside any of these companies, these victim companies, or the supplier, Supermicro, that was potentially a plant of the Chinese government? That's what a counterintelligence investigation looks for. Are there insiders at any of the victim companies, or victim companies that received the contaminated servers, or the supplier that supplied them, Supermicro? And what a counterintelligence investigation is, it's a long-running, open-ended investigation into trying to ferret out spies, and not only ferret them out, but to try to flip them, and to try to turn them into spies for the US. So this is not kind of an ordinary criminal case that's being handled by the FBI, where you could expect to find the hackers and see their names on billboards. I mean, it could happen. But because of the fact that this is a counterintelligence investigation, an ongoing counterintelligence investigation, don't expect to see any kind of public results anytime soon, or perhaps ever. Next question here, are the banks and the other processors working to protect consumers? We don't have a visibility into every company, but we know that large companies take this issue of supply chain security very seriously. They have processes in place in terms of chain of custody over who handles which parts of which servers. Yeah, so companies take this seriously. I think what this story is, or should be at least, is kind of a wake-up call to anyone who isn't taking hardware security seriously. If you work for an organization and you have lots of computer equipment, and you're responsible for people's data, whether that's your own companies or others, you have to have a process in place for at least understanding that your hardware could be a vector for attack as well. That's kind of that's kind of the big lesson here. We've got a lot of questions coming in. That's really great. Let's see here. Let me get to the next one here. Let's see. Let me welcome some new viewer, any of the new viewers who've joined us. This is Digital Defense. This is our weekly cybersecurity and privacy show. We're talking today about the big hack, which is our cover story on Bloomberg Business Week this week. It is a story about a hardware supply chain attack from China in 2014 and 2015, targeting U.S. companies. This involves malicious microchips embedded on server motherboards that are designed to compromise those systems and allow attackers to take over them. We've gotten some great questions. Let's see here. Okay. All right. Next question here is, besides Apple and Amazon, what other companies purchase these infected motherboards? As I mentioned earlier, Supermicro has hundreds and hundreds of users, hundreds of large customers around the world. So anybody from, in terms of victims, we can only talk about what we've reported, which we have reporting on Apple, we have reporting on Amazon, we have reporting on Elemental, which is a division that Amazon acquired in 2015. We do say in the story that there was a large bank involved in this as well, but I can't go beyond that. But what I can say is that Supermicro's customer base generally includes large web hosting companies, cloud companies. They're known for their motherboard, configuration and kind of clever designs, energy efficient designs and things like that. So organizations that worry about space and power and processing lots and lots of data, like Supermicro. Next question here is, what impact could this have on the supply chain? If I understand the question correctly, will this change the way that companies procure computer hardware? Well, maybe not. I mean, it's hard to predict. But what I can say is that, what this could be and probably will be is a wake-up call to organizations to, again, just make sure that hardware is on your radar screen. It is a vector of attack, just like the web application you use to log in your website, just like your corporate email database. It's just another vector of attack, but it's a very serious one. So if you're not looking for these problems, you don't have any mechanisms in place to look for these issues, chances are you're not going to find them. Another question here. Let's see. In terms of, I feel at this point I should mention, the fact that the companies in this story have denied the reporting. So, we publish those companies' statements in full on the website and in the story. And what I can say is this, which is our story speaks for itself. We have robust sourcing, including having conducted interviews with more than 100 people. We have 17 sources with direct knowledge of the events described in the story. Those include senior officials throughout the U.S. government, and that also include senior executives, senior insiders within Amazon and Apple, that are familiar directly, have direct firsthand knowledge of these events. We have robust sourcing, again, 17 direct sources, and you can check out the company's denials for yourself. We've published them in full, on the website. And next question here is, did we already know that China was working on, capable of devising these kinds of schemes? Well, we've heard government officials talk a lot in very generic, general terms about beware supply chain attacks, beware supply chain attacks. We've heard this for years as reporters. And the maddening thing is that we know the government knows things about hardware tampering that has occurred, but we've never gotten a look at it. Snowden's documents, the Snowden leaks, were one of the first real glimpses that anyone got of how hardware manipulation actually works. And again, the U.S. has very different capabilities than China, and very different, because the U.S. by and large doesn't own manufacturing for computer hardware, so the NSA uses primarily different methods according to the Snowden documents. So we already knew that China was aware and that this was a possibility, but this story is one of the first to really bring to light, facts about how these attacks actually work in practice. So next question here. So what's going to be the way forward for companies? And is the U.S. going to retaliate and move business to make these components elsewhere? Hard to, impossible for me to know. But again, kind of my, the point, the drum I keep beating on this is, it's not so much that the equipment is made in China that concerns folks. Obviously, that concerns many U.S. national security officials, but companies like this model of made in China because of the cost and, frankly, the expertise that China has developed over the last 30, 40 years of how to make and assemble advanced hardware equipment. In many cases, there are capabilities you can't get anywhere else. Even the U.S. government uses, hardware that was made in China. You can't get around it. But the drum that I've been beating is really, you don't have to tear up your supply chain just because this attack happened, but you do have to have awareness, and you do have to be, you have cognizance of the fact that hardware can be attacked the same way as software. And because China owns manufacturing for most, computer equipment manufacturing and assembly, or much of it, this is a capability that China's been developing, and we kind of get our first look at it through this story. With that, we are about out of time. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you haven't read it already, please go to the Bloomberg website and check out The Big Hack. We're really proud of the reporting. It's taken us a long time, and we think shines a light on a really important issue that's in the public interest. I'm on Twitter. It's at JordanR1000, JORDAN, the letter R1000. And you can check out our website at bloomberg.com/technology. With that, see you next week on Digital Defense. Thanks for tuning in.